This sequence of 2 courses and a couple of talks that I've given here. And so before I begin today, I'd like to make some special thanks. First of all, for setting this entire thing up and creating such an amazing and wonderful environment where everything went smoothly and I never had to think about anything except giving my presentations. And of course, to my wonderful host here in Moringa, and for the wonderful opportunity to go to Puerto Rico, to the field station, and the opportunity to be in Brazil again, which was wonderful. And I'd also like to make a special thanks to our incredible technical crew, both in Curitiba and here, who made all of this possible. Made me feel like a rock star, international internet phenomenon. Okay, so it's not really that, but that's been wonderful. It's been amazing just to see what we can do. So thank you all very much for that, and many thanks to the students here and in Curitiba as well, both for your attention and for the questions that you've asked and the discussions we've had, which have been very educational for me. So this has certainly been a two-way street, a two-way dialogue. And that's a good segue, because what I want to talk about first today is about unifying biogeography. Now, in this whole month that I've been here giving talks, you've come to realize that, like Darwin believed, historical biogeography turns out to be a really central issue in an enormous number of different aspects of evolutionary biology and biodiversity and so on. And
I think that
sorry, I forgot to turn that on. So no one in Curitiba heard that wonderful series of things.
with this
Microphone. So maybe you heard all that. Okay, anyway. If there are any technological problems, it's my fault. It's not the fault of the crew. Okay, anyway, back to and I'm going to take, like I almost always do, I wander off script, of course. And it's, nostalgia is a conceit of age. So as you get older, you get to talk about your past experiences, and everybody forgives you for that because they say, wow, he's old. But this story actually has a point. I have a friend, 2 years ago, I was honored to be chosen as a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Budapest, Hungary. And one of the other visiting senior fellows at the time was a philosopher of science named Malcolm Fish from Tel Aviv, who became a really good friend of mine and an incredibly important colleague. And Menachem, in addition to having, being an internationally recognized philosopher of science, Menachem is also very much involved in high-level interactions between the Vatican and Israel. So these are interactions between Catholicism and Judaism at a very high level. And Menachem told me a story one time of being part of a conference at the Lateran University, the Vatican's university in Rome, and it was advertised as a interfaith dialogue. So this is a term that's used when Protestants talk to Catholics, Catholics talk to Jews, Catholics and Jews talk to Muslims, and so on and so forth. And Menachem said he got up to give his talk, and all these cardinals, sitting in the audience, all these really important people, and he said, I got up and I said, I don't believe in interfaith dialogue. And they're like, whoa! And he said, because what interfaith dialogue means is that you have two opposing points of view, and each side just reiterates its point of view to the other side. And the underlying expectation is that if you keep repeating your viewpoint long enough and forcefully enough, the other side will convert. And so he got up and he said, okay, I don't believe in interfaith dialogue because I'm not going to become a Catholic and you're not going to become Jews. this conference cannot be about conversion. What I'm here for is I want to find out what Catholics think about Judaism that Jews don't think about it, because we're so deeply in our tradition that we don't see ourselves the way others do. And maybe the same will happen in reverse, that maybe the Catholics can find out how Catholics appear to Jews. And this will give you some insight into yourself. And from that standpoint, he said, so I believe in interfaith discussions and interfaith learning. Now, the reason I bring that up is because, like almost everything that all the discussions I had with monogamy, they weren't just friendly discussions. They were these extremely high-level, high intellectual content points of view that were always extremely valuable to me. And this helped me understand some reactions that I've had, because during my career, one sort of ongoing interfaith dialogue that has been happening ever since the cladistic biogeography and the vicarious biogeography revolution started is this discussion, this interfaith dialogue between the religion of historical biogeography and the religion of ecological biogeography. And a couple of days ago, I talked to you about this, or maybe it was yesterday, no, it was 2 days ago, this big meeting that I attended at the American Museum in 1978. And that was one of these big interfaith dialogues, because there are a bunch of ecological biogeographers there, a bunch of these new radical historical biogeographers, and they each got up and they presented their stuff and they attacked each other, and nobody learned anything. Like I said, I was so focused on vicarious biogeography at that time that I didn't even recognize the significance of Terry Irwin's taxon pulse concept. Now, in the 30 years since then, there have been these consistent sets of meetings and papers and interactions where ecologists say, you know, you historical biogeographers have to add more ecology. And the historical biogeographers say, you ecologists have to add more history. And it goes on and on and on. Now, everybody says in public, they start by saying, we want a unification of biogeography. We want the ecology and the phylogeny together. They start out by saying that. And then they argue with each other about how to reduce ecology to phylogeny or how to reduce phylogeny to ecology. And what I'm going to show you today is actually a protocol that allows us to unify ecological and historical biogeography. But I will tell you that the reaction to this new approach has been the only time ecological and historical biogeographers have been unified. And they've been unified in saying, we don't want to do this. Because the reality is that most of them want to argue. They don't want to cooperate. They want to argue. They don't want to unify. They want to reduce the other side to ashes so that they're the only ones that survive. It's all about conflict. It's very neo-Darwinian. It's survival of the fittest, and we're going to fight until one of us is dead. There's no conflict resolution in this. So what I'm going to show you is the conflict resolution. And then let you know that most biogeographers don't want to hear about this. But most biogeographers that are angry about this are my generation. They're not your generation. So you have a choice. You can just ignore all that warfare and just do something interesting if you want to, if this seems like a reasonable way to go. So, here's how we go about doing it. And it seems deceptively obvious. How do we integrate ecological into historical biogeography? Well, get more history into ecological biogeography, get more ecology into historical biogeography. Okay. That sounds good. Okay, how do you add ecology into historical biogeography? Well, the first thing you have to do is get rid of this albatross around our neck called vicarious biogeography. because you cannot add ecology. There's no reason to add ecology to historical biogeography if it's all vicariance, because vicariance has nothing to do with ecology. It simply has to do with some sort of physical subdivision of the earth. And ecology is irrelevant. Ecologically mediated modes of speciation are irrelevant. Responses to climate change, irrelevant. Secondary sympatry doesn't happen. So ecological and reproductive consequences of secondary contact between close relatives are irrelevant. There is no way inside this paradigm to even get to a position where ecology would even seem to be relevant. The taxon pulse, on the other hand, changes all of that. In the taxon pulse, ecology is an essential part of understanding the movements and the speciation events that characterize evolutionary diversification and biogeography. So this is nice. We have a hypothesis now that allows historical biogeographers to say, I need to know the ecology. We have to. If we adopt the taxon pulse as the null model for historical biogeography, that means we have to have ecological information in our historical explanations. And that's what historical ecology is all about. You now know that there's an enormous amount of information that you can get about the history of ecology. And all of that can be explained, at least in part, by referring to geographic distributions. Okay. Now, what happens if you add history to ecological complexity, to ecology? What you're doing is making something that appears to be simple more complex. And that's one of the reasons people don't like it. Okay, adding ecology to historical biogeography makes historical biogeography much more complicated, much more complex. Most people don't like that. Adding history to ecology is the same thing. People don't want to take this stuff into account. That's why there are a lot of ecologists who want to treat phylogeny as something that needs to be corrected in an analysis variance model, or the error term in an ANOVA. Okay, that's why we hear so many ecologists still saying, even after 20 years, still saying, is it history or is it ecology? Is it evolution or is it ecology? It's like, are you actually saying it's like evolution or creationism? I mean, what really do you mean by that? What they really mean is, I don't want to mess with all that complexity. I'm happy with the simple way I do research, and I don't want you to really bother me. Okay. Now, the equilibrium theory of island biogeography is not inherently history-free. Okay, MacArthur and Wilson, in the original paper in Evolution and in their book in 1967, did discuss the effect or the anticipated effects of history on ecological biogeography. What they said was two things. First, historical effects will disturb the expectations of the equilibrium model. And the second thing they said was, therefore, we should study small young islands where there are no historical effects. Instead of saying, therefore, we need to find a way to really characterize the historical effects and study the historical effects on old island biotas. And the reason they said that was because in the 1960s, I mean, their book came out at a time when phylogenetic systematics was just beginning to appear and be read in English. So at the time, they recognized that there was no scientifically defensible method for generating hypotheses of phylogeny. They had no way to anticipate phylogenetics or the development of comparative phylogenetic methods. So they basically said, yes, this is a potential problem, but we can't deal with it empirically, so let's just control our experiments spatially so that we eliminate the effects of time. Now, that was also a very neo-Darwinian kind of approach, or at least it was consistent with the neo-Darwinian hardened synthesis by the 1960s and 1970s that said that phylogeny is not anything explanatory. But they did have, in their general heuristic equation, they have this variable called G, which was the standard for historical effects. I don't know why it was G. Maybe it was for But what they said was that if you choose small enough, young enough ions, you can assume that G is 0 and you can just eliminate it. Okay. So what happens when we look at species area relationships using old big islands, or things that we can conceive of as old big islands, like pieces of Mexico, for example. Here's what happens if we take those areas of endemism for that big biogeographic study of Mexico, and we do the basic MacArthur-Wilson species area curve. What we're looking for is a log normal linear relationship between the number of species in an area and the size of the area. Now, I have to tell you that when we first submitted this manuscript, some of the reactions we got were very interesting. People would say, "You can't do this." Some reviewers said, "Well, the MacArthur-Wilson model doesn't apply to all species in an area. It only applies to particular groups of species. So you can only do this comparing insects and insects or plants and plants." But that's not what MacArthur and Wilson said. In their original book, they said this is the general explanation for the numbers of species of living things in an area. Now, if this is really the general unifying theory of ecological biogeography, then it's got to be general, right? So it's very interesting that the initial reaction was, no, you're not using it correctly. And the reason for that was because we didn't get anything that was very close to a linear log-normal relationship. Now, it turns out that the reason we don't get a nice fit to a linear relationship is because of these two areas. These are two small areas with a lot of species in them. And these are the two areas, the Mexican transition zone and the area south of that. These are two small areas that we know from the larger historical analysis are areas that have been affected by the largest number of the general vicariance and expansion episodes. So these are areas that are very small, but have been the most active historically. They've been affected by the largest number of historical events, and they have an unusually and unexpectedly high number of species in them. Now, typically, if you find something like this under the MacArthur-Wilson model, ecologists would look at this and say, here are two small areas with a lot of species. Those areas are out of equilibrium. Therefore, this is a place where there's an enormous amount of interspecific competition going on, and over time we expect the species diversity in those areas to drop down. But these are not young areas. Okay? The evolutionary events that will build up the diversity in those areas are 30 million years old. Some of them are more recent. But we're talking about millions of years, not hundreds or thousands of years. So as far as we can tell, this high diversity is stable high diversity. And that's out of equilibrium in terms of the mathematical expectations of a particular model. Now, the equilibrium models in ecology are static models. They're not inherently evolutionary, just like vicariance is inherently a static model. It's not a dynamic model. It doesn't tell you how The vicariance model doesn't tell you how species become widespread enough so that they can be affected by vicariance. And the equilibrium theory of island biogeography doesn't tell you where species originated. Because in the equilibrium theory of island biogeography, every species that occurs in a particular area came from someplace else. And this is what philosophers sometimes call the view from nowhere. If everything came from someplace else, nothing ever came from anywhere. There's nothing in the model that says, where did they come from in the first place? Where did they originate? What areas did they originate in? Oh, the mainland, the source. It's like, well, what is that? No, it doesn't matter. Because we're only interested in this. But again, if this is supposed to be a general explanation for the numbers of species in areas everywhere on this planet, then unless you're suggesting that every species on this planet colonized from outer space, your theory is deficient if it doesn't include a component of where did things begin in the first place. So here's what happens when you add history. Okay? The first thing that happens is you add history by virtue of examining old large islands instead of young small islands. Now, just as McCarthy and Wilson predicted, if you do that, you're going to see historical effects. This deflection is the result of the influence of that magical variable called G. It's like, oh gee, there's more history than I expected. But if you have a detailed analysis from your historical biogeography that allows you to distinguish species that originated in the areas from species that have colonized the area, then you can make some additional comparisons with respect to the McCarthy-Wilson model. For example, remember, if there's an unusually high number of species in an area, what we expect is that interspecific competition will reduce that number. Okay, so if areas are not at equilibrium, they are below equilibrium, which means they're young and they're still filling up with colonizers, or they're above equilibrium, which is expected to be an unstable situation, which will be resolved by competition. And some species will be eliminated and the diversity will drop down to the equilibrium number. So one of the things that means is that there should be a very strong relationship between this number of species in an area and the area size and the number of extinctions. And it turns out that there's actually, for inferred extinctions from a historical biogeographic perspective, there seems to be a pretty good relationship there. And that's because these two little areas out here that have a lot of species in them also seem to have a large number of inferred extinctions. Okay, well, again, that just means they are central, have been central parts of this dynamic, this repeated taxon pulse dynamic that's affected Mexico. It's just that these data plus the previous data basically tell you that speciation rates have been higher than extinction rates, but not disproportionate to area size. So it's a more complicated kind of calculation. And here's the thing that's just really cool to me, is that if you look at the relationship between colonizers and area size, which is what the McCarthy-Wilson model was designed around, the assumption is that everything is a colonizer, it turns out that there's virtually no relationship between whether you're a colonizing species, the number of colonizing species, and the area size. There's actually a much better fit between the number of species that evolve in situ and area size in this data set. But there's no relationship here between colonization and area size. Aha. So that's kind of interesting, because we know the number of species in each area, the size of each area, the distance of each area from the others. We have all this data. If we have a historical biogeographic analysis based on assumption zero methods, we also know which species in each area are the result of colonization and which are the result of in situ speciation. which are the residents, which are the colonizers. Plus, we can figure out the direction of colonization. And this turns out to be a real key, because in the MacArthur-Wilson model, not only is there the assumption that everything is a colonizer, the assumption is that colonization is always unidirectional. Okay. So, in situ speciation and the size of the area, look, a much better correlation between that and the size of the area than between colonization and the size of the area. That means, essentially, that it looks like, at least for this data set, that there are no inherent limits on how many colonizers can move into an area. And part of the reason for that is because the hidden assumption about equilibrium thinking in ecology is that there are these real, that places are made up of these real material boxes called niches. And there's only a certain number of them. And once they're filled, that's it. You cannot put more species into the area unless one leaves. That's a static, non-evolutionary view. An evolutionary view is that any species that colonizes an area that can find somehow to live in that area will live there. Now, parasitologists instinctively have this view of the world because we recognize that every species that evolves uses some resources but represents potential resources for something else. Every new vertebrate that evolves represents new resources for parasites. So as long as vertebrate evolution is going on, there's going to be no end to new habitat for our parasites. And in fact, that kind of habitat is generated to such a high degree that most vertebrate habitat is still unoccupied. There's a huge diversity of parasites out there. But the reality is that if you look at all of the potential resource space, usable resource space that's represented by, say, catfish intestines, most of it's unoccupied. An enormous amount of or underutilized resources out there. So the reality is, from an evolutionary perspective, there's no reason to think that any particular area has any inherent limitation on the number of species that can live there. There are only limitations on the number of species that can live together that have the same resource requirements. And that's not the same thing. If resource requirements can evolve, that is, they are not properties of the environment. They are properties of the organism. That's why I said in my first presentation 3 weeks ago, that there aren't any niches in the sense that niches are material parts of the environment. What we call niche is simply a term that we put on that component of the nature of the organism that has to do with necessary resources. Organisms need to get resources from their surroundings in order to survive. Okay, but the surroundings are not inherently organized as resources or niches or anything like that at all. The extent to which species can be packed into areas has to do with the extent to which there is ecological diversification in phylogeny. It has nothing to do with the environment. This is a property of the organism, not of the environment. That's why you have to have history. Because phylogeny is the embodiment of the evolution of the nature of the organism. And you can't actually understand everything that's going on without that. There is no such thing as evolution-free ecology unless you're a creationist. Now, here's another thing, another way to reinforce that. If there is an inherent limit on the number of species that can be in an area, then when you do a correlation between the number of species there by colonization versus the number of species that are there as a result of in situ, the residents versus the colonizers, you should have a nice linear relationship. You have X number of residents, you fill that's below equilibrium number, you fill it up with colonizers, equilibrium number, and then from that point on, if a colonizer comes in, a resident has to go out. And you expect to have a stable relationship between those two things. And there isn't any. And the reason there isn't any, oh look, it's those two stupid little areas again, which seem to not care how many species there are in the area, and seem to not care whether the species are produced in situ or by colonization. And it turns out that these are the two areas that have been affected by the largest number of historical alterations. So here's what we get. Species richness versus extinction. Okay, there seems to be a pretty good fit, but we now know that there's a technical glitch with that because a lot of the inferences of extinctions that we make, secondary loss inferences that we make in historical biogeography are flawed. As soon as we allow dispersal as a possibility, a lot of the things that we would have explained as extinctions of the past are equally parsimoniously explained as dispersals. So that's a caveat on this. Colonizer richness and area size, there's no relationship. Okay, the number of colonizers in an area is more a result of opportunity, okay, than it is the result of anything to do with the size of the area or the amount of niche space that that area represents. The number of species produced in an area and the size of the area, there does seem to be a correlation there. But species produced in an area and the colonizers don't have anything to do with each other. So there's nothing about producing species in an area that limits colonizers. There's nothing about colonizers that limits the number of species produced in an area. They have almost nothing to do with each other. It's as if they were two different processes. And I'm going to come back to that later because in that same classic issue of the Missouri Botanical Garden that had Ed Wiley's paper on how to study speciation with phylogeny, my paper that used historical ecology for the first time, Vicki Funk's paper on how to figure out hybrids from correlated homoplasy, also had an article by Joel Craycraft on rate controls of speciation and extinction, in which Joel basically anticipated this. Okay. Now, what about real islands? Because that was one of the criticisms too. Oh, these are chunks of the mainland, and we know that the MacArthur-Wilson model only applies to real islands. Well, okay, if it's supposed to be a general model, then it should be a general model. So if you're saying, okay, it only applies to real islands, not mainlands, and it only applies to particular groups of species, then what you're saying is it's not a general model at all, it's just a description of some interesting things we noticed about some groups of organisms on some islands. Now that doesn't sound quite as good as the equilibrium theory of biogeography. Okay, so the paper that we just published last year, where we did a packed analysis of the Greater Antilles and the packed analysis of Hawaii, this is what we found. In the Greater Antilles, you have about a 56-44 difference between colonizers and species produced in situ, and 85% of the colonizations are from older islands to younger islands, and only 15% are younger islands to older islands. And guess what we get? We get a really nice MacArthur-Wilson result. Oh, this is cool. So now we're beginning to see, if you have 0 degrees of freedom, you have one study. What does it mean? We don't know. That first study in Mexico, all we really knew was, oh look, here's a protocol we can apply. But the results didn't mean anything because they had no context. It was the first time anybody tried that. All we showed in that paper was that the protocol was workable. You could do this. So that's why we then wanted to do some real island biotas to find out. We also wanted to find out if the taxon pulse signature would show up in other contexts. And it turns out, as I pointed out yesterday, that in both of these cases, the taxon pulse dynamic shows up in historical analysis. So as far as historical biogeography is concerned, the taxon pulse dynamic, that pattern, seems to be universal, and that seems to be independent of whatever groups of organisms you're talking about, whatever kinds of geological formations you're talking about. Chunks of continent, real oceanic islands, continental islands, it doesn't matter. Okay, and in Hawaii, we've got sort of the opposite. Only 40% is biotic expansion, 60% is in situ speciation. But we still have 65% of the dispersals are from older islands to younger islands, and 35% are backwards. Now, in this particular case, you don't get a good fit to the power law unless you remove Hawaii, which is the youngest and biggest island. And the reason that including that, screws things up is because for its size, it doesn't have that many species. Why? Because it doesn't have that complex a history, because it's young. Not because of its size, it's because of its history. It's big geographically, but it's little as far as history is concerned. And some of the smaller, older islands actually are enormous with respect to historical influences. And it turns out that if you exclude Hawaii, you get a nice fit. Oh, that's very cool. Now we go back to the Mexican stuff and say, look, if you exclude those two little areas that are just this super highway that gets affected by everything, if you exclude those, you get a nice fit. Ah, okay. So now what's the generality that's emerging? The generality is that as long as you have a system in which the biotic expansion events are predominantly unidirectional, they don't have to be completely unidirectional. They can even be just about 2/3 in one direction. You're going to get, for the most part, a good fit to the MacArthur-Wilson model, even with history included. And the exceptions, the areas that perturb the log-normal linear relationship, are going to be explainable. They're either small areas with a lot of species because they are big with respect to history, or they're big areas that are young and have a small amount of history. So the area is time. The space is space-time. The size of the islands is the temporal size of the island, not the actual physical geographic size of the island. And when the geographic size of the island and its historical size are more or less the same, then you get the power relationship, the power law relationship, even when you add historical effects. Now, I think that's pretty cool. But mind you, we only have 3 examples so far. And it would be really nice to see what happens after we get 40 or 50 examples. And see what we get. Does this still hold true? Because if it does hold true, then we actually do have ecological and historical biogeography unified. Now, my generation of people are too embedded in the conflict to ever use this, to ever explore this. But you know, it's the job description of the younger generation to have nothing to do with the battles of the older generation. You have your own battles to create. Okay, your job description is, we're going to solve all the problems you old guys created. And that's true. You're going to make your own problems, but you will solve all of our problems. And that's what you're supposed to do. So, here's how it appears now. MacArthur and Wilson were correct. In situ speciation can confound the species-area relationship. And that occurs when the same areas function as islands and as sources. In other words, it is back colonization that creates the disturbance in the forest. See, as long as you have just forward colonization, and now we know that as long as it's just 2/3 forward colonization, that species-area relationship is robust. Okay, and what we're talking about basically what we're talking about are situations in which the spatial size of the island and the historical size of the island are the same. The spatial footprint and the historical footprint. When they match up, then you get the expectation of McCarthy real small. When they don't match up, it is the historical dimension of the islands that creates the greatest impact. It is not the spatial size, it is not the physical size of the island. And this is just another way of expressing this notion of Darwin's, that it is the nature of the organism and not the nature of the conditions that determines biological diversity. So the historical size of the island is just another way of saying the nature of the organism. And the spatial size, spatial dimension of the island is another way of talking about the nature of the conditions. Okay, so what did Darwin say? Darwin said there are these two aspects to evolution, the nature of the organism and the nature of the conditions. And of these, the nature of the organism is by far the more important. And that's what happens. The nature of the organism, when there is a mismatch between the spatial footprint of the island and the historical footprint of the island, it is the historical footprint that prevails, which results in a distortion of the power law. So, Darwin was extraordinarily smart. And he was 150 years ahead of all the rest of us. So how does that actually happen? Well, mechanically now, it's one thing for me to say, now these are metaphors, right? The size of the island. Size is a metaphor, and it could be a metaphor for space or a metaphor for time. Okay? This is all very metaphorical. Now, in terms of real nuts and bolts, muddy boots biology, how does this happen? Well, it happens when you have colonizers that can recolonize the source area. That is, when the relationship between the source and the island is reversed. Now, the only way that can happen is if evolution in the island by the colonizer results in a functional change in those species, an ecological change, a behavioral change, which allows them to return to the source area with requirements that do not compete with anything that's already there. So if you have occasional niche diversification, resource diversification, adaptive change in ecological traits, however you want to think of it metaphorically, if you have any kind of functional change during the speciation process by a colonizer, such that if it returns to the source where its ancestor or closest relatives are, they will not compete because they're differentiated, then you have the possibility of back colonization. And if there is a high enough level of that kind of back colonization, that is, young species in old areas, then that's how you get this mismatch between the historical footprint and the spatial footprint of an area. Now, one of the things that means also, of course, is that this niche diversification is what most people will call it. Ecological change, adaptive change and speciation. Those are all synonyms for the same thing. Functional change in speciation. Functional change correlated with speciation. What that means is that when you have a species that has colonized from the source, become different as a result of evolution, and then goes back to the original source, not only is it mechanically capable of surviving in the new area because it does not compete with its closest relatives, but because it represents a new kind of resource utilization in that community. The quote-unquote equilibrium number of species allowed under the MacArthur-Wilson model changes. So one of the things that evolutionary diversification does is that it changes the equilibrium number. It says that the equilibrium number of species in a geographic area evolves. It is a function of the historical footprint. It's just, and that's just another way of saying the same thing. So it's very cool because, of course, one aspect of the pulse in the taxon pulse is that you have this expansion and then isolation, and somewhere in the isolation some innovation happens, which then allows that to spread out in the next wave, because it now can spread out because it's doing something that nobody else in those other areas does. So this is how you can build up complex ecosystems, but that also means that potentially the only limit on the number of species in an area is the number and kind of historical events that affect the area, not the actual physical size of the area. I mean, I think this is really cool because I love these kinds of metaphors. I love this, you know, this is why Darwin kept talking about biogeography and inheritance. Because, you know, space and time, that's what evolution is all about. But it also means that Joel Craycraft in 1985 was correct. This is from that now classic Missouri Botanical Garden number. Speciation and extinction are under different rate controls. And that's how you get this mismatch between expected numbers of species in an area and extinction rates. Inferred extinction rates have nothing to do with inferred speciation rates. That's because extinction correlates well with the spatial footprint, but speciation doesn't. Because speciation has to do with the nature of the organism. Extinction has to do with the nature of the conditions. Now, Joel said that speciation is largely controlled by geography because he was promoting this maximum vicariance thing. But in reality, speciation is controlled by the extent to which expanding species can be subdivided geographically and produce diversity. Okay? And he said extinction is largely controlled by what he called environmental harshness. Okay? So speciation is largely controlled by opportunities permitted by the nature of the organism in species that expand over large areas of geography. Extinction is largely controlled by things that happen in the environment that the species that live there cannot escape. And this is a very Darwinian thing. That Darwin said, unlike Lamarck, who believed that whenever the environment changed, species stayed where they were and adapted, Darwin said, when the environment changes, species that cannot escape die and go extinct. Very, very rarely do they stay in place and adapt. Because adaptation is something, new adaptations are literally something that cannot be afforded in evolution except when you don't need them. We talked about that yesterday. When can you host switch? When you don't need to host switch. It's the same sort of thing. Or as Deborah McClellan and I pointed out, extinction is not a failure to speciate, it's a failure to adapt. Now, all of the ecological models that treat speciation and extinction as coupled birth and death phenomena are wrong. That's not how speciation and extinction are connected. Speciation and extinction are two completely different things. Speciation has to do with the nature of the organism and environmental opportunity. Extinction has to do with the nature of the conditions. And the nature of the organism is more important, as Darwin pointed out. So this means that the paper that Losos and Schluter published in Science in 2000 is not correct. In situ speciation and colonization are not causally linked. They wanted to suggest that high rates of speciation by high rates of colonization depressed rates of speciation in the island, high rates of speciation in the island depressed rates of colonization. Not true. How come they were wrong? Well, it's because speciation and extinction are under different rate controls. There is no necessary link between two different kinds of speciation and extinction. So that means that there cannot be a relationship between kinds of speciation and the number of species in a place. There can only be a relation between speciation and extinction, and it's an indirect relationship. And it's a relationship in which, unless the spatial footprint and the historical footprint of the area are the same, you're going to see an accumulation of species above a stable accumulation of species, above the expectation of the McCarthy-Wilson model, because evolution changes the equilibrium number of possible coexisting species. That's because evolution is not an equilibrium phenomenon. It's a non-equilibrium phenomenon. It's a historical phenomenon. So the way to unify biogeography is to have a non-equilibrium theory of island biogeography, is to recognize that the core metaphor called area is something that is a metaphor for both space and time. And so we can talk about how much those overlap and how well they match each other. And we have to understand that one of the things that makes this a non-equilibrium phenomenon is that evolution is more important than ecology. Well, evolution is more important than the environment. Okay. Ecological changes are a function of evolution, not a function of the environment. The nature of the organism is more important than the nature of the conditions. So, how do we integrate historical and ecological biogeography? Oh, just add history, add ecology, put them together. It's all cool. It's really very cool. And nobody wants to hear about this. You know, most biogeographers who go to the International Society of Biogeography with respect to this kind of thing, it's like the three monkeys, you know. See no integration, hear no integration, speak no rehearsal. But if it's a good idea, it's going to happen anyway. They can't stop it. It's like, you know, 49% of Americans are really unhappy that the president's black. Tough. He's black. They're really unhappy that the ideal American family is black. And it lives in the White House. So I have hope. When I was a volunteer in the civil rights movement in the 1960s in Washington, D.C., none of us ever thought we would ever, there was no possibility we would ever live to see a black president. Damn. So maybe there's hope for ecologists and evolutionary biologists. And of course, here's old George Gaylord Simpson, who hated phylogenetic systematics, nonetheless saying, you know, the way to get ecology and evolution together in sociography is to take a historical approach. Well, yeah. Non-equilibrium theory of biogeography. Speciation and extinction are under different rate controls. So the combination of speciation and niche diversification makes an equilibrium number of species in an area a dynamic number. There is no such thing as a static equilibrium number of species allowed in an area. And that's because evolution itself is a non-equilibrium phenomenon. Cool, eh? All right. Now, let's take 15 minutes and come back, and then I'm going to hammer you again about your social responsibility with respect to evolution and biodiversity. All right. The last session. Congratulations to everybody who had the strength to survive all of these, including me. Okay. So, I want to talk at the end now. I want to talk about evolution and what I call the triple threat. And that is that the biodiversity crisis, the climate change crisis, and the emerging disease crisis are all linked together. They're really all different parts of the same issue in a sense. They are each very complex, and the way they're linked together is very complex. And that means that we scientists, because it's going to be up to the scientific community to provide options, to provide solutions. We have many responsibilities, and we have very little time. And so, for me, here comes another trip down memory lane for Dan. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and the first presidential inauguration, the first speech by a new president that I ever heard or remember hearing was in January 1961 by John F. Kennedy. And one of the things that he said in that speech to the American public was, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And that got translated into things like the Peace Corps and a lot of very progressive, positive kinds of activities by Americans. Unfortunately, at that same period of time, there were a whole lot of Americans in Vietnam trying to kill a bunch of people who actually lived there. So nobody's perfect. But I get to just cut out that one part of the Kennedy Doctrine, this. And that's just one way of saying that I actually believe very strongly that if as scientists we see that there is a major problem that could potentially affect the survival of humanity, at least the survival of technological humanity, and we don't do something to try to contribute to a solution, then we are at least ethically bankrupt, if not morally bankrupt. And that means, among other things, that we not only have to produce really, really good research, we also have to be involved in policy making. We have to talk to non-scientists. We have to talk to our families, our neighbors, friends. We have to talk to our students. I mean, that's why you keep getting this. I actually had a teaching evaluation one of the last years before I retired in Toronto. I was getting teaching evaluations, not a lot, but a few, that said things like, I signed up for a biology class, not a class in sociology and political science. And Professor Brooks's hippie roots are showing, and things like that. It was not a lot. I also got teaching evaluations that said, this is why I came to university. So it kind of balanced out. We also have to talk to the public, and we have to talk to politicians and planners, policymakers. Now, all of these different groups of people have different vocabularies and different ways of speaking to each other. And one of the things we have to understand is that the way you speak to another scientist scares the crap out of most non-scientists. Scientists are blunt, brutal, objective, short, concise, and we can handle that because we're scientists, we're trained. Someone says, listen, this is going to happen in 20 years if we don't do blah, blah, blah. The scientist goes, okay. You can't just say that to most people. Most people are not prepared to handle bad news the way scientists are. And part of our training is that we're pretty tough. The people who make it all the way through a PhD program in any kind of science are very tough. And we're hard realists. We can handle bad news. But we have to understand that most people cannot handle bad news. Most people are already afraid. And they don't like it if we make them more afraid. And in fact, if we make them more afraid, it will be counterproductive to what we want to do. So we have to talk to them, but we can't make them afraid. So one of the things that means is that you have to learn how to talk to different groups of people. Dan Jansen, who's a great figure in biodiversity in North America, says that once he became 100% involved in biodiversity, that he then became a student of human natural history. He learned how to speak to different groups of people. Okay, and one of my favorite ecology books is Dune. Some people think it's a science fiction book. It was one of my most important ecology texts. And there is something called the Litany Against Fear, something that the Bene Gesserit women relish. I must not fear, fear is the mind killer. And it's true, and this is a difference between people who are trained professionally to be able to handle bad news and those who are not. We read this and we kind of laugh and say, well, yeah, that's what I do. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I stood up and somebody pointed a pistol in my face. It can also mean something like I had a meeting with my PhD committee, or I got a bunch of reviews from an editor, or I had a PhD defense, or I had a grant proposal. We deal with these kinds of challenges all the time. And through that process, you learn how to deal with fear and anxiety. You learn how to survive it. You learn how to let it go through you and past you. Okay, now, what is it we're trying to save? That's the first question we have to ask. And I'm going to suggest to you is that this is what we've spent most of the last 50 years talking about. That's what ecologists and biologists talk to the public about. We've got to save species. We've got to save places. This species is so cute. This place is so beautiful. Right? What right do we human beings have to deprive that species of animal a right to exist just because we want to do something that would keep people in the local area from starving to death? Okay, that's how the argument has come out in public. That's the caricature of biologists. That we care about polar bears more than we care about human beings. We care about giant pandas more than we care about starving children. And we have created that perception. It's our fault that that's the way most people perceive us. Now, conceptually, it's the result of focusing on this, of believing that the solution to this problem doesn't involve evolution and doesn't involve humanity. It's based on the notion that the solution involves just those species and just those places. But you have to remember, this is a very Platonic kind of view, isn't it? If we take human beings away, it's the Garden of Eden. It's perfect. Everything will be fine. Now, is that a solution in a world full of human beings? Is it any wonder that if you bring that message to a politician, they go, get out of my office? So again, we're our own worst enemies. We have created an environment where we will never, ever accomplish anything. And it's our fault. But we're so fixated on, oh my God, this place is so beautiful. Look at that beach. Look at that estuary. Look at all those mangroves. Look at this serpentine outcropping. This is heaven. This is an incredibly interesting place. And look at this. Isn't that cool? That's really beautiful. This is really beautiful. And the world is full of that. And biologists are privileged to be able to see an incredible number of beautiful places and really interesting looking plants and animals. The problem is that that's not working. It's not working. We are playing a losing game. In tennis, if you're playing against Djokovic or Nadal and you're trying to hit from them with them from the baseline, you're going to lose. I mean, it's a matter of time. You may lose quickly or you may lose in 3 hours, but you're going to lose. So you might as well try something different. You may lose anyway, but you have to first admit, I'm losing. And the problem is with a lot of champion athletes, they're not that flexible. They will normally say, and this is one of the reasons that Federer lost to Nadal for a very, very long time, because Federer kept saying, I'm not going to change my game. I'm just going to elevate my game and beat him with his game. No, you're not. No, you're going to lose. It's just going to take him 4 hours to beat you when it only takes him an hour to beat everybody else. But you're going to lose. You have to understand when you're losing a game, and you have to have the courage. You cannot be afraid to say, we thought we were doing the right thing. It's obviously wrong. Okay, so the first thing the scientific community has to do is to be honest with itself and say, it's not working. And then we have to say, so what are our options? And part of the reason that a lot of people, especially a lot of ecologists, don't want to admit that they're playing a losing game is because they don't have any plan B. They don't have any other options. They don't know what the other options are. Okay. Dealing with each of these crises separately and one species or one area at a time is a losing game. So here's another possibility. That what we're actually trying to say is humanity. Okay, and there are a bunch of different arguments to this. One of the arguments is, well, if we had a lot fewer people on this planet, there would be no biodiversity crisis. Okay, now this is a typical argument from an academic who has a very comfortable life in a country where there's almost no poverty and there's certainly no biodiversity crisis. And my answer to that sort of thing is always, and I've done this with some of you already, is to say, okay, I'm going to buy us 2 airplane tickets to India. And you and I will fly to India. We will go to a remote village. I will hand you a rifle. You kill half the people there. You choose your choice. That's how we'll deal with human population, right? Oh, no, I don't mean, that we should actually kill people. I said, okay, then I'll hand you a scalpel, and you can decide which 50% of the people in the village to sterilize. Oh, well, no, I didn't mean that. It's like, I want us to be able to force them to do it. It's like, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Besides, the people who are saying something like that, we should make them reduce their population. Okay? Doesn't that sound a little bit like genocide to you? Especially since many of the people who have that viewpoint come from cultures where there is either a negative birth rate or a sustainable birth rate. And they accomplish their own population control without killing people and without sterilizing people. How did they do that? Well, it turns out that we actually know how to control human population. Human population is enormous, and it's going to take some time to get the human population down to a better level. But we know how to do it. Because every single country that has lowered its birth rate has one thing in common. Lots of educational opportunities and economic opportunities for its women. In fact, that is the official plan of the Costa Rican government for population control. More educational programs and more jobs for women. And that's it. Give women an opportunity to control their own economic destiny, they will control their reproductive output.
So, excuse me.
Oh. Oh. Didn't say this one. I want money from Eveready. This man can out-talk an Eveready batter. Pay me. Okay. Now, I actually do think that our primary reason for being interested in any of this stuff is that we're trying to preserve humanity. And specifically, we're trying to preserve technological humanity. Because my argument goes something like this. Every single person who is a hardcore conservationist, environmentalist, biodiversity specialist uses the internet. Okay? Everybody who is a hardcore developer who's cutting down the rainforest uses the internet. Okay, we have something in common, right? There are certain things that everybody wants to preserve. So we actually have something in common, which means that we should be able to find a negotiating table. We should not just be in a situation where we yell at each other. We actually have some things in common. One of the things we have in common is that we actually want our children to survive. We actually want to have electricity and automobiles and airplanes and the internet and Xboxes. We want our stuff. Well, but this is non-trivial. If you go to a lot of developing countries, they don't want us to become poor. They want what we've got. And who are we to say they can't have it just because we do? That's also, another form of genocide. You're not killing them directly. But you're saying you're always going to be poor. You're always going to only live to be 35 years old. Half of your children are going to die before they're 3. Sorry. That's just as much genocide as saying we're coming in with rifles and we're killing half the people in your village. So that's not actually a workable solution. Even if in your heart of hearts you think that the world would be better off if there were only 100 million human beings on this planet, that's not a solution. You know, that's not a negotiation point. It's not a plan. And if you talk about it, you make people afraid. You make people afraid that scientists believe that we should just go in and kill everybody. And then the world will be fine. Why do we want to kill everybody? Because we don't really care about humanity. We really care about gorillas and chimpanzees and rare orchids more than humans. Okay, and then we're completely discredited. So again, we're doing this to ourselves. So the reality is that we do want to preserve humanity. But we have to express that in a way that's also associated with biodiversity, climate change, and emerging diseases. Okay? Now, one of the things you can say in the United States, where 49% of the people don't believe in evolution but do believe in angels circling the planet and watching out for us, how's that working out? You can always refer to a biblical quotation where God is supposed to have said to Homo sapiens, or the representative of Homo sapiens, you see all this life out here, see this biosphere? You can use it, but it's your responsibility not to kill it. All right. This is also a losing game. We should get rid of half the human beings on this planet argument. That's a losing game. And the argument of you don't care about human beings, and we're developing this planet, we're cutting down the rainforest because we care about humanity. That's also a losing game. It's the more powerful game politically, but it's a losing game in terms of actually saving humanity. And the reason that's a losing game is because if you're trying to save humanity without understanding how critical a healthy biosphere, a diverse, healthy biosphere is to the survival of technological humanity, then you're going to be making mistakes. So this kind of thinking is what led Deborah McClellan and I to say in the final chapter of The Nature of Diversity, said what biodiversity specialists are actually trying to preserve is evolution. We're not trying to preserve a particular species or a particular place. We're trying to preserve the process. And it's the process that produces, not only produced us, but also produces the biosphere that we rely on. And it's the only mechanism we know of that replenishes a biosphere after it's been depleted by things like major climate change. And we've seen this before. Elements of the biosphere are not just really cute. Some of them are really kind of ugly. Now, I showed this amber pigeon because how many of you have ever seen any of the Harry Potter movies? Come on. I'll admit, I looked at some of them. All of you have. Raise your hand. Okay. Now, there is a scene in one of those Harry Potter movies that's supposed to be some sort of big attack of spiders. Look closely. There are a few spiders, but most of them are around the pigeons. Bad taxonomy, Harry. Okay. Not all the elements of biodiversity are very nice. Some of them are not so nice. Some of them are little teeny tiny, like 95% of the species on this planet are microscopic. That's a drop of water. It's a water mite in a drop of water. And that water mite undoubtedly has an entire community of microbes in it. Not everything about biodiversity is obvious. Not everything that's important is obvious. So this little pseudoscorpion here on the cerambycid, okay? We have to avoid becoming involved in arguments about saving biodiversity where what we're really talking about is, I don't want you to destroy the things that I'm doing my research on. And we have to understand that even toxic things are part of the world. Okay. Evolution is the one process which we know for certain can repair and replenish a biosphere that's depleted by climate change. So at the very least, we need to preserve the evolutionary process as a plan B. If we think our plan A is that we're going to stop climate change, then just in case we're wrong about that, we should have a plan B. And a plan B should be plan A during the last 3 billion years of history on this planet. Plan A has always been, whenever there's a major environment, global climate change event that wipes out a lot of biodiversity, there is one process that brings the biodiversity back, and that's called evolution. So evolution holds the key to effective policy. Now, in the last couple of weeks, you've learned a number of things about how phylogenetic information can lead to interesting research, but can also provide answers to questions that are important questions to ask about biodiversity. If you're studying functional change, functional diversification, adaptation, you can use natural history requirements. You can use phylogenetic distribution of natural history requirements to predict what endangered species might need in the absence of being able to do direct sampling. Non-destructive policymaking. You can predict the ecology of introduced species and biological control agents. You can ask how many species there are and what kind of species there are on this planet. Because different species are produced in different ways, and that makes them more or less susceptible to different kinds of perturbations. How did they arise? Where did they arise? When did they arise? How old are they? Historical biogeography. How often do species disperse from their area of origin? And under what conditions? If one of the major stimuli for massive dispersal events is climate change, what should we be seeing happening now? And what should we anticipate is going to happen as a result in terms of biogeographic distributions? How often do closely related species co-occur in the absence of anthropogenic changes? That's going to tell us whether or not our plans for altering the landscape are going to be in concordance with normal evolutionary processes, or we're going to be introducing a new kind of phenomenon. Do closely related species have similar geographic ranges? Do some groups colonize better than others? And paleontologists have a lot of information about this. We can ask how old is an area? And what is an area? And that is areas for priority areas for saving based on phylogenetic information. And that ultimately has to do with looking at the relationship between the size of the area historically and the size of the area geographically. Do we save the places where the oldest species live? Do we save the places where the youngest species live? Do we save the places where the maximum species richness is, where the highest rates of reticulations are, where the lowest rates of reticulations are? I mean, there are arguments for and against each one of these. And we're not using this information at all in deciding what our conservation areas are going to be. We're not using any evolution at all to decide about that. In addition to that, we are talking about this, but it's the fact that it's even a controversy is astounding. Conservation areas that are not connected with each other by dispersal corridors are evolutionary dead ends. They are concentration camps for species. They are places where we imprison species and watch them go extinct. Because that's not how evolution works. And the reality is that we're doing the wrong thing with respect to the concept of buffer zones. We have a conservation area, and then we build zones around the conservation area and say, you can't have any development closer than this, but you can have enormous amounts of development right up to the edge of the buffer zone. That's not where the buffer zone should be. The buffer zone should be around the cities, not around the conservation areas. Evolutionary radiations. Are there particular traits or particular groups that are associated with evolutionary success, evolutionary persistence? Species that have lived the longest, clades that have been on this planet the longest, have passed through the largest number of environmental perturbations, global climate change events, and they're still here. What is it about them? Can we learn anything about that? What traits and what groups are most vulnerable to extinction? What are the attributes of species that have always been evolutionarily ephemeral, like things living in cloud forests? Let's match up where we put our money with the places where evolutionary biology tells us we have the greatest chances for success. Don't waste your money, because we don't have that much. Don't waste your time, because we don't have that much. Communities and biotas. We don't know anything about the phylogenetic associations between keystone species and their communities. We don't know if phylogeny is the reason why a species may be a keystone species in one community and not in another community.
It may be a keystone species where it originated, but where it's dispersed into, it may not be at all. We're not asking those questions. We don't know. How many historical influences has each community experienced? Okay, if the story about the Mexican transition zone is that you can pack an enormous amount of species diversity with high stability into a small area as a result of many evolutionary events affecting the area, well, that's a plan. Let's look for places like that. Maybe those are the places we should be safe. Pathogen evolution. What can we do with phylogenies and pathogen evolution, emerging diseases? Well, we can predict, anticipate host switches, not just for pathogens, but also for our vital control agents. We can predict life cycle patterns, the transmission dynamics, the natural history of pathogens based on phylogenetic conservatism. And that allows us to establish proactive rather than reactive public health policies and veterinary health and agricultural health and wildlife health policies. And one underlying all of this is the fact that we don't know anything about the biosphere. And that's our fault too. Why don't we know more? And what have all of those taxonomists been doing for 200 years? Well, I've been having a good time. Out in the field, getting stuff, looking at things, figuring out what they got, talking about my group, my new species. Definitely contributing to society. In terms of the biodiversity crisis and our need to understand the biosphere, every single taxonomist is guilty of taking money dishonestly for their salaries. And ecologists are worse because they're acting like creationists and not evolutionary biologists. That's why I always think about dirty Harry. And Peter Wise. Okay? What is this? Now, what Peter's talking about here is fear. Fear. People are afraid, people are afraid. Now, the interesting thing about this in terms of human psychology is that fear is the complement of empathy. So, here's the thing. If you actually have great empathy for humanity, if you have great empathy for the planet, for the biosphere, and so on, if you're not a trained scientist, that amount of empathy can be transmitted into a great fear. Such fear about the future that you don't do anything, that you're paralyzed. And that's the point at which people say, well, set your sights low. Just be reasonable about this. We can do something. Yeah, we'll give you a little park here, but we're going to build a high-rise over there. And you go, okay. Now, like I said, we don't have very much time. We really don't. We've been digging around for 30 years now, saying, we got 500 years, we got 200 years. We have about 40 years. And that's 40 years to implement policies, not 40 years to develop plans. We can't afford to do business as usual as academics, where we go to meetings, where we yell at each other, where we say bad things about each other's manuscripts and review. We try to keep each other from getting grants funded. We say bad things about each other. We don't cooperate. We say, my way is the right way, this way is bad. We can't do that anymore. We can't afford to have that kind of fun. That's what academics have been doing ever since the origin of Western universities in 9th century monasteries. That's where this comes from. That's what this is. Our ancestors were a bunch of men living together without bathing, having no sex and no contact with officially having no sex, having no contact with the outside world, and thinking great thoughts, great spiritual thoughts. We can't afford to do that anymore. And we can't afford to say, you're a competitor. Therefore, I don't want you to get any funding, and I don't want you doing any research, and I don't want any reporter to talk to you. Everybody should talk to me. I should be the biggest. We just simply can't afford to do that. It's very human to do that, to feel that way. And our academic system is set up to encourage that kind of behavior, but we can't afford it. So, here's our problem. We have to admit that we're playing a losing game without making people more afraid than they already are. So, evolutionary thinking. What I've talked to you about in the last few weeks, I hope, provides at least some ways that we can think about climate change and policy. We have to admit that we cannot stop it and we cannot change it. We may be able to buy some time, but we may not even be able to slow it down. Mostly because we don't actually understand the dynamics of this climate change event that's unfolding. However, if we use evolutionary biology, we can anticipate and adapt. And if we focus not on this, but on this, then we don't add to the fear. Yes, it's okay that climate change is going to happen. We have a plan. Because we have evolutionary biology, and we have paleoecologists, and we have seen this before. This is not the first climate change event in the history of this planet. We know what happens. We know what happens. We know what's going to happen. We may not be able to say what's going to happen next Tuesday, but we know in a general way what's going to happen, and we know what the consequences, the evolutionary consequences are, which means that we can anticipate and adapt. Now, I've used this metaphor before, this analogy before, sorry. The American defense, the American military, spends millions and billions of dollars every year producing plans for wars that they hope they will never have to fight. And nobody thinks that's a waste of money. That's what we have to suggest to all of our governments, is that no one will think it's a waste of money to spend taxpayers' dollars to create plans. If this happens, this is what we should do. If this happens, that's what we want to do. The only country on this planet that has done that is the Netherlands. They have invested an enormous amount of money in new, better dikes and dams to keep the ocean out because they know that the sea level is rising and is going to rise a lot more. And in fact, they know that no matter how good these new dikes and dams are, half of their country is going to be flooded by the end of the century. And they have already decided which part of the country they are going to flood. And they have already told the people who live there where they're going to be relocated and how their living is going to be provided for. They will have their jobs, they will have a place to live. Now what happens if sea levels don't rise? Will all the people in the Netherlands demand their money back from the government and say that was a waste of time? No! They'll have a party. On the other hand, suppose there is a massive sea level rise and the government had never planned for it. Would anybody be angry at the government? Yes! So the only time people get angry with the government is when they don't anticipate something. That's what we're offering. Instead of going and saying, you better give me money to study my lizards in the Caribbean or climate change is going to wipe out New York City. We have to say, we have a plan. And we would be glad to create an explicit, detailed written document that is a planning document in case this happens. And we can do that for every single possible scenario so that the government will have this big set of books, and no matter which possibility happens, when it's clear that that's what's happening, they can pull that book out and say, here's what we're going to do. And it won't cost very much money, because the truth of the matter is most of us academics work pretty cheap. You know, the reality is that, you know, you buy me an airplane ticket, put me in a hotel, let me go to restaurants in Washington, D.C., talk to reporters about how I'm an important scientist on important business in Washington, D.C. You don't have to pay me anything more than that. I mean, you know, we're not in this business for the money, because we're all smart enough to do something else that would make money. Okay. What about the biodiversity crisis? Same thing. One of the things we have to stop doing is using the word destruction. Okay, in this country, inside this country, outside this country, there's an enormous amount of controversy about your hydroelectric dam strategic plan. Okay? One side of the argument talks about providing renewable energy, non-polluting renewable energy for socioeconomic development. And the other side of the argument says you're destroying the biosphere. They're not destroying the biosphere, they're changing it. Now, like I've said before, destroying the biosphere is you dump a whole bunch of toxic chemicals into a river and everything in the river dies. That's destroying it. You put it down on the river, you've changed it. In evolutionary terms, you've created a vicarious event. In evolutionary terms, you have changed one long, thin selection regime into two very different selection regimes. Costs and benefits. Yes, some species may go extinct, but other species may actually benefit from it. We have to always speak in terms of changes and costs and benefits, not just in terms of destruction, when what we mean by destruction is it's not going to look the way it was when I was doing research there. I don't like the dam on my river. We have to show that we can compromise and adapt. If you're going to do this, here's how to minimize the evolutionary impact of what you're doing. Don't add to the fear. Don't use words like destruction. About the emerging disease crisis. Well, the truth is that this planet is a minefield of potential evolutionary accidents waiting to happen. There are lots and lots of potentially emerging diseases out there. And we're going to see a lot of them emerge over the next 40 years as a result of climate change. But if we know where they are, we can anticipate and adapt. So instead of saying, be afraid, be very afraid, you say, give me money to do an inventory of pathogens in places where human beings are not living now, but may live in the future. You know, the only reason the Ebola virus is a problem is because nobody had done an inventory of viruses in parts of the African forest where human beings did not previously live. If we had a taxonomic inventory that said, oh, there's this virus up in the tops of the trees that human beings could pick up if human beings went up there, we would simply say, if you're going to be in that part of the forest, don't go up into the tops of trees to cut wood. You'll get sick. And you won't just get sick, you're going to die, and you're going to die a horrible death. The only reason Ebola is a problem is because of a lack of taxonomic inventories. If you know where the pathogens are, you can mitigate their impact. We can be proactive, we can anticipate, we can do something about this. We can relieve the pressure on public health systems, the economic pressure on public health systems, because being proactive, being preventative is always cheaper than responding to a crisis. And we don't add to the fears by saying, oh my God, the planet has all these hidden killer viruses and one of them's going to wipe out humanity. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen is what's happening already. We're going to have a lot of little viruses, a lot of little bacteria, a lot of little parasitic worms. And each one is going to take some cost. It's going to take some resources out of the economy of a country. And each one is going to accumulate. That's what we call pathogen pollution. And eventually, public health systems are going to collapse, not because one thing is going to kill humanity, but because there's so many little things that we simply don't have the resources to respond. Evolutionary biology can help with that. Don't be afraid. We have a plan. Okay? Now, you know the Jane Austen principle. That is, again, we can't afford usual academic business. We have to go from pride and prejudice, which is how academics deal with each other now, to sense and sensibility. We have to go to a state of enlightened mutual interest. We have to be smart enough to understand that if I give up a little bit and you give up a little bit, you give up a little bit, everybody benefits. And that if nobody gives up everything, nobody benefits. We have to understand that, and not just ecologists and evolutionary biologists. We have to be talking to biotech people. We have to be talking to the commercial developers. We have to be talking as partners with the people who are producing those hydroelectric dams. Okay, now that's happened in limited numbers of cases. Okay, when I was very young, hydroelectric dams were being built in the United States, and they were just big dams right across the river. Okay, there was an enormous amount of discussion, and eventually, the people who were building those dams agreed to put fish ladders along the edge, so that migrating fish could move up and down the river. It didn't cost them very much. It worked. Everybody was happy. Win, 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 win. Partnership. Cooperation. Give up a little bit, get something back. If you say, you can't put the dam up, you're going to lose 100% because the dam's going up anyway. Because this is what we're trying to save. We are trying to save technological humanity and the evolutionary process that's responsible for producing and maintaining the biosphere that is essential for the survival of humanity. This is a negotiating arena. This is a place where we can work together, everybody. And I put this on Facebook the night after the election for my American friends and said, this could become habit-forming America, doing the right thing. You actually feel good about yourself when you do the right thing. It's that simple in a way. So, do not be afraid. We have a plan. Okay. Thank you very much for everything. And good luck with everything. That's it. Time for lunch. Bye.